Have you ever had an emotional reaction that felt completely disproportionate to the situation? Maybe it's when your partner forgets to do a small chore, and suddenly you feel a surge of rage or a profound fear of abandonment. Or maybe it's when your boss offers a mild critique, and you instantly feel worthless, ashamed, and paralyzed. You look back later and wonder, why did I do that? That wasn't me. It feels as if some invisible force is hijacking your nervous system. It's like living in a house, and suddenly the lights start flickering, doors slam shut, and the temperature drops for no apparent reason. You call the electrician, you check the windows, but you can't find the source. In psychology, this phenomenon is often attributed to a concept you've likely heard of, the inner child. But here's the problem. Most of what we're taught about the inner child is overly simplistic, or worse, it leaves us feeling more powerless. We're told to love your inner child, or reconnect with your childlike joy. That sounds great, but it doesn't help when that child is busy burning down your relationships or paralyzing your career. The truth is, your inner child isn't just a cute, playful version of you. It's also the keeper of your deepest pain, your unmet needs, and your most powerful defense mechanisms. And if you don't understand how it operates, you'll forever be stuck fixing the symptoms without ever addressing the root cause. In this video, we're diving deep into the neuroscience and psychology behind the inner child concept. We'll expose why traditional approaches often fail, and most importantly, we'll give you a practical, no-fluff blueprint for doing the real work of healing. We call this the integration protocol, because the goal isn't to go back in time, it's to bring the past forward into the present wholly. Welcome to Psych Blueprint. To begin this integration process, we need to clarify what we're really talking about when we say inner child. The old paradigm suggests the inner child is something to be indulged or, conversely, disciplined. It's the idea that if you had a difficult childhood, you're permanently damaged, and the only way to cope is to blame your parents or relive the pain indefinitely. This way of thinking keeps us stuck. It creates a separation between adult you and child you, as if they are two different entities vying for control. The new paradigm, grounded in attachment theory and modern neuroscience, is radically different. Your inner child is not a literal little person living in your psyche. It is a collection of neural pathways, emotional memories, and coping mechanisms that were etched into your brain during your formative years. Let's go back to our inner house metaphor. You, the conscious adult, live upstairs. You make decisions, you plan, you interact with the world. The inner child resides in the basement. This basement isn't a scary place, it's the foundation of the house. It holds the wiring, the heating system, and the original blueprints for how the house was built. When you were a child, you were completely dependent on your caregivers for survival. Your brain was wired to adapt to that environment at all costs. If you grew up in an environment where expressing emotions was unsafe, you learned to suppress them. If you only received attention when you achieved, you learned to equate your self-worth with productivity. If your caregivers were inconsistent, you learned to be hyper-vigilant for signs of abandonment. These adaptations were genius when you were 5 years old. They kept you safe. They were your original protection software. The problem is, you're now 35 and you're still running the same software. When your boss critiques your work, that old software doesn't hear, "Please improve this report." It hears, "You're not good enough, and you're in danger." And that's when the hijacking happens. The inner child, feeling threatened, runs up from the basement and takes over the main control panel. Meet Alex. Alex is a talented lawyer at a top firm. He's rational, capable, and ambitious. But Alex has a problem. Whenever his senior manager, an older, stern man, calls him into his office, Alex completely freezes. His mind goes blank. He stammers and can't defend his work even when he knows he's right. It's devastating his career, and he hates himself for it. He tells himself, "What is wrong with me? I'm a grown man. It's just a meeting." But it's not adult Alex sitting in that office. It's 8-year-old Alex. Alex's father was a loving but intensely demanding and critical man. Nothing was ever good enough. Any attempt at self-defense was seen as talking back and was punished with cold silence. 8-year-old Alex learned that the only way to maintain connection and safety was to stay quiet, please, and never challenge authority. When Alex's manager frowns, Alex's brain recognizes a familiar pattern. Powerful man, unhappy. The outdated protection software activates. Danger. Freeze. Stay silent. Recognizing this is the breakthrough. Alex isn't weak. He's caught in a programmed trauma response. And this is where it gets interesting. There's a neurological reason why Alex can't just think his way out of this. It has to do with how the brain processes threats, and it's much more complex than just having an inner child. Understanding this mechanism is the next step to dismantling it.
So, how do these core wounds form? It comes down to the fundamental developmental needs that all children have. Dr. Gabor Mate, an expert on trauma, talks about two primary needs: attachment and authenticity. Attachment is the need to be close, loved, and cared for. It's a biological imperative for survival. Authenticity is the need to be ourselves, to express our emotions, and to explore the world freely. In an ideal world, both of these needs are met. We feel secure in our relationships and free to be who we are. However, in reality, these two needs often conflict. A child might learn that if they express anger, authenticity, their caregiver withdraws or punishes them, threatening attachment. When forced to choose between attachment and authenticity, children will almost always choose attachment. They sacrifice authenticity to maintain connection. And that is where the core wound forms. It's the moment we disown a part of ourselves in order to survive. The most common wounds fall into a few categories. The abandonment wound, the fear that you will be left alone, rejected, or unwanted. The guilt wound, the feeling that you are responsible for others' happiness, or that you are a burden. The trust wound, the belief that the world is unsafe and people will ultimately let you down. The neglect wound, the feeling that your needs don't matter and that you are invisible. These wounds become the lens through which we see the world. We don't see objective reality, we see a world colored by our past experiences. The inner child, then, is the guardian of these wounds. Its job is to make sure we never feel that pain again.
How does the inner child wield so much power over our adult brains? This brings us back to neuroscience and a small almond-shaped structure called the amygdala. The amygdala is the brain's smoke detector. It constantly scans the environment for threats. When it detects a threat, it triggers the fight, flight, or freeze response in milliseconds before your prefrontal cortex, the rational part of your brain, even has a chance to process the information. Here's the crucial point. The amygdala stores emotional memories, but not narrative memories. It doesn't store the story of what happened, it stores the feeling of what happened. And for the amygdala, time does not exist. When Alex sits in his boss's office, his amygdala isn't saying, "Oh, this is Mr. Johnson, and he looks similar to my father when he was angry back in 1995. It just screams, "Danger, powerful man, angry. Activate freeze protocol." This is called an amygdala hijack. The inner child, via the amygdala, has seized control of the nervous system. At this point, Alex's prefrontal cortex is offline. That's why he can't think clearly. That's why telling himself to just calm down doesn't work. You can't reason with a blaring smoke alarm. This mechanism explains why our self-sabotaging patterns are so stubborn. If you are a people pleaser, it's because your inner child believes that saying no will lead to rejection, a mortal threat to a child. If you are a perfectionist, it's because your inner child believes that anything less than perfect will lead to criticism and shame. These behaviors are not conscious choices. They are automatic trauma responses designed to protect you from a threat that no longer exists. Now, this is where many people get skeptical. They might say, "This sounds like an excuse for bad behavior," or "I don't want to blame my parents for my problems." Let's clear up a few crucial points. First, understanding is not excusing. Recognizing that your behavior stems from past wounds does not absolve you of responsibility for your actions in the present. On the contrary, it empowers you to take responsibility. Once you understand the mechanism, you can begin to change it. Second, this is not about parent blaming. Most parents do the best they can with what they have. They are also operating on their own outdated software. The goal of inner child work is not accusation, but understanding. It's about recognizing generational patterns and deciding that the cycle stops with you. Third, and this is very important, you don't just have one inner child. This closes open loop 2. The idea of a singular inner child is a useful simplification, but it's not the whole picture. In models like internal family systems, IFS, we talk about parts. You have a 5-year-old part that feels lonely. You have a 14-year-old teenage part that is rebellious and angry. You have a manager part that tries to keep everything under control through perfectionism. You have a firefighter part that tries to extinguish emotional pain with addictive or distracting behaviors. All of these parts have positive intentions, even when their behaviors are harmful. Healing involves becoming a compassionate leader for this complex internal system, rather than just focusing on one child. However, for the purpose of this video, we'll use the term inner child as shorthand for all these vulnerable, wound-carrying parts. The cost of ignoring the inner child is immense. It's not just about feeling bad sometimes. It affects every aspect of our lives. In relationships, it leads us to choose partners who recreate familiar childhood dynamics. If you have an abandonment wound, you might be drawn to emotionally unavailable people because that feels familiar. Or you might push people away to avoid getting hurt. In careers, it manifests as imposter syndrome, fear of success, or an inability to set boundaries. Like Alex, we can paralyze our own potential because our inner child is terrified of being seen or criticized. In physical health, the link between childhood wounds and chronic health problems later in life is well established. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study shows a direct correlation between childhood trauma and everything from heart disease to depression and autoimmune disorders. When we are constantly in a state of high alert, triggered by our outdated software, our bodies are flooded with cortisol and adrenaline. We are living in a state of chronic stress. Let's check back in with Alex. Before he understood this, he was on the verge of burnout. He wasn't sleeping. He developed digestive issues, and he started withdrawing from his wife because he was so ashamed of his struggles at work. His suffering wasn't caused by his job, it was caused by his internal war. He was spending so much energy trying to suppress that scared 8-year-old that he had nothing left for his present life. This is not sustainable. You cannot build a fulfilling adult life on a crumbling internal foundation. The good news is, there is a way to update that software. There is a way to go down into the basement and help the inner child feel safe. This process is called reparenting, and it starts with learning how to listen. Welcome to the Integration Protocol. This is our blueprint for reparenting yourself and healing old wounds. This process is not fast or easy, but it is transformative. It involves 3 stages: recognition, investigation, and nurturing, sometimes referred to as the R.A.I.N framework: recognize, allow, investigate, nurture. The first step is learning to recognize when your inner child has been activated. You cannot heal what you cannot see. Remember the inner house. You need to install an intercom system between the upstairs, the adult, and the basement, the child. This starts with paying attention to your body's signals. When you are triggered, you might notice a rapid heartbeat, a tightness in your chest, a hot flush of shame, or a sudden urge to cry. These are signals from your nervous system that the amygdala has taken over. This is where we use the spotlight technique. When you feel that intense emotional reaction, pause. Take a deep breath and ask yourself this crucial question: how old do I feel right now? Don't overthink it. Trust the first intuitive answer that comes up. Alex started practicing this. When his boss called him in and he felt the familiar panic rising, he asked himself, "How old am I?" The immediate answer was 8. This simple act of recognition is a game changer. It immediately creates distance between adult Alex and 8-year-old Alex. He realized, I am not this child. I am the adult observing this child experiencing an emotional flashback. Your homework. For the next week, commit to using the spotlight technique every time you feel triggered. Just notice the age. That is the first step. Once you have identified the inner child, the next step is to understand what it needs. Remember, the inner child's behavior is always driven by an unmet need. This requires curiosity and compassion, not judgment. Once you have connected with this younger part of you, ask it these questions. What are you afraid of right now? What do you need to feel safe? What are you trying to protect me from? Listen for the answers. They may not come in words, but as feelings, images, or memories. Alex did this with 8-year-old Alex. He asked, "What do you need?" The answer he received was, "I need to know it's okay. I need to know I'm not in trouble just because I made a mistake." This was the core need: safety and unconditional acceptance. When we investigate, we usually find that the inner child's needs fall into one of 3 categories: safety, the need to be protected from physical and emotional harm; seen, the need to be acknowledged, validated, and understood; soothed, the need to be comforted, cared for, and loved. Identifying the specific need is crucial because it tells us exactly how to proceed with the final stage: nurturing. Nurturing is the process of giving your inner child what it needed back then, but right now, in the present. This is the core of reparenting. You become the ideal parent you always needed. This involves 3 elements: validation, comfort, and boundaries. 1. Validation. Your inner child needs to know that its feelings are real and important. Alex started telling 8-year-old Alex, "You have every right to be scared. What happened to you wasn't fair. It makes perfect sense that you froze to stay safe." This immediately reduces the intensity of the emotional reaction. The child feels heard. 2. Comfort. This involves soothing the nervous system. It can be physical, placing a hand on your heart, giving yourself a hug, or taking deep breaths. It can also be verbal. This closes open loop 3. Alex's small shift in self-talk was that he started speaking specific reassurances to his inner child. "I'm here. You're safe now. We will get through this together. You don't have to be perfect to be loved." This might sound cheesy, but it is profoundly effective. You are speaking directly to the amygdala in the language it understands, the language of secure attachment. 3. Boundaries. This is an often overlooked part of reparenting. A good parent doesn't just provide comfort, they also provide structure and protection. This means setting boundaries in your current life to protect your inner child from further harm. For Alex, this meant preparing for meetings ahead of time so he felt more confident. It also meant learning to say to his boss, "That's a valid point. I need a moment to review that and I will get back to you." Instead of freezing, he was setting a boundary to protect his emotional space. By practicing these 3 stages, recognition, investigation, and nurturing, we begin to update our outdated software. We are teaching our amygdala that the old threats are no longer dangerous. Over time, your inner house begins to change. The inner child doesn't need to run up from the basement and take control anymore. It trusts that you, the adult, are running the show. And when that happens, something magical occurs. The energy that was once used to suppress pain and fear is now liberated. You become more creative, more joyous, and more connected. You start living a life that is no longer dictated by your past. The journey of healing the inner child is not a one-time event. It is a lifelong practice. It is a commitment to yourself, a promise to never abandon yourself again. When we started this video, we talked about the feeling of being stuck, the feeling that you are living in a house haunted by your past. But as you do this work, you realize there are no ghosts. There is only a scared child waiting for you to come find them. And when you go down into that basement, not with judgment or frustration, but with compassion and curiosity, you begin the process of integration. You begin to become whole. Alex still feels anxiety during high-stakes meetings, but now he has the tools to handle it. He can soothe 8-year-old Alex and still remain the competent adult Alex. He is no longer controlled by his freeze response. He has reclaimed his voice. And you can too. This work is the bravest thing you will ever do, because it requires you to face the parts of yourself you have spent a lifetime avoiding. But the reward is priceless. It is the freedom to be fully yourself without apology, without fear. It is the feeling of liberation through understanding. So, here is my challenge to you. Don't just watch this video and move on to the next one. Actually take that first step. Right now, close your eyes, place your hand on your heart, and ask your inner child, what do you need right now? Listen to the answer, and then make a commitment to give that to yourself. If you found this video helpful, share it with someone else who might be struggling with their past. And subscribe to Psych Blueprint for more science-backed blueprints to master your mind. Thank you for watching, and remember, your past is not your sentence. It is your starting point.